We were part of a group of people that put together, got a bus out from New York City with about 25, 30 people on board, about 22 veterans, I think, and about 5 civilians. And it was a very difficult ordeal just trying to get the bus to leave New York City. And that was the easiest part. Once it got out there, that's when everything started falling apart. So I didn't even get on the bus. I took a Greyhound to Cleveland, and Josh from Syracuse picked me up and dropped me off at Eagle Butte. And from Eagle Butte, I slept a couple hours and then got on a truck with a Green Beret guy that almost took us off the road, doing 70 miles an hour, trying to get to Cannonball. So I got to Cannonball, a couple hours, squared away the kitchen, because the kitchen was a mess, and an Army cook for 35 years cooked everybody lunch, and I had a flight to catch. And I got Trent and Trent's father drove me to Bismarck to get on a plane to come back, because I had to be back by Monday. So it was like 60 hours of a dream, and I thought I was going to die a few times. But just what I learned was that when people say they have PTSD, you should believe them, because there's real dysfunction with a lot of these veterans. That the Josh who drove, he drove 30 hours straight with 2 breaks of like an hour. 30 hours. He was in Iraq, Afghanistan. It was like a suicide mission. I just went to sleep in the back, because I thought we were going to go off the road eventually. And the guy who took the 2 breaks, took over for the 2 breaks, John Westerfield, was just here just the other day, and he said he was hallucinating for the 2 hours he drove. So I don't know how we got there. So it was just amazing. And I just want to say, as veterans, we're used to being told what to do, when to do it, and we have to change that dichotomy. You know, like I got out of the military and I went to work as organizing stuff. You know, we can't allow people to tell us when to do something and what to do. We have to start being the organizers. You know, we have that top-down mentality. We got to wait for orders, all this other stuff. You know, I've been out of the military 28 years. I served in the Cold War, you know? So I just saw a lot of people just waiting around for people to tell them what to do and not willing to do stuff for themselves. And that is not the answer. We got this guy Trump in charge now. All bets are off now, you know? I went out there to see what was going on, because the enemy right now is the government. It's always been the government, but hopefully people start waking up. You know, we need to take care of business now. It's no more joking around.
My name is Karen Chamberlain. I'm from Sayville, Long Island, New York. I'm with Long Island activists. It's my second trip out to Standing Rock. I was actually out in Standing Rock from November 18th through what happened there on the bridge. We left on Monday, the 21st, which you don't see in the media. Things have happened at the bridge then as well, where DAPL security guards had live ammunition pointed at us, basically trying to find a reason to storm the camp. And someone with the megaphone had announced out. Well, let me just back up for a minute. DAPL had said there was somebody with a gun on our side, which was not the case. There was only really a handful of people there because there were a lot of actions going on in Bismarck that day in Mandan, and a lot of people with what happened the night before, being injured, being cold, and just fatigued. I think DAPL knew that they would have a good opportunity to maybe storm the camp. There were school buses. As we know, school buses lined up mean they're about to take a lot of people away. Police cars, vans, and so forth for no reason that morning on the bridge. And this gentleman with the megaphone had said, please, we're protectors. We don't want someone that has a gun on their side. And had said, pointed out to us. They looked around and they didn't know what to do. They pointed to a photographer who had a long lens camera. long lines. That kind of got extinguished that day, but later on that day, we took some pictures from above the bridge, and they did have water cannons out again that day. So that has not been in the media, what happened that day. We left later that afternoon. We had some people that had to get back. I personally went on the first caravan with 5 individuals, packed with donations in the car, and different experience. Both my experiences were beautiful in their own way, but it hasn't been the same. The second time I went out there was I left on December 3rd, got stuck by a snowstorm, thought I was going to get killed, not really kind of make it there. The roads were closed, had to sleep in a car. We were supposed to meet up with another caravan from Philly with an RV. They kind of went off the road. They really never got there until a week later. It's supposed to be a 10-day journey. Everybody, thank God, is okay. But it was a whole different feeling in the camp. And I can understand how you feel, because the sense of bringing the veterans out. I had missed that day the veterans had gotten out there, and then they had stopped everybody to get in to be able to help. I didn't go home. I stayed and I drove through about 10 tractor trailers off the road. Couldn't see in front of me. I knew it was important to get these donations. We kept hearing that things were stopped, that the Army Corps had, stopped everyone to go home, not to bring donations. I knew that wasn't the case. I knew that wasn't the case from my first trip that I was up there. I knew medics were needed. I knew supplies were needed. And so we just continued forth. Once we got up there, the roads were clear finally when we were able to get into the camp. And I met a few veterans that were staying up in the Prairie Dogs hotel casino. I have mixed feelings about it because all of the misinformation that had gotten out is exactly what it was, misinformation. You have to remember that the veterans that were there, 2,000 or 2,100 of them were sponsored for. 4,000 had shown up. And then, boom, there was a blizzard the day they showed up. Blizzard with freezing temperatures. I had 3 pairs of long johns on, good boots. I had sub-zero sleeping bag, everything. And my fingers I still couldn't feel. They were out there in terrible conditions, not expecting that to have happened. And to have turned around with that many people, I have to commend them, and I have to commend the tribes that were there as well. They were all looking out, everybody was looking out for the welfare of everyone involved. And with Standing Rock not having anything else on their shoulders being handed to shut down the camp by DAPL or anyone else. And I think everybody handled it well. There were problems getting some veterans out due to funding that was being held up by banks and so forth in the area. Just so you know, there are tons of donations stuck in Bismarck because Bismarck will not let it through. So donations that are going through. There's another thing, that Sacred Stone Camp has a lot of donations where Oceti Sakowin was not getting those donations. So I had come back from this the second time, and I walked my donations around from tent to tent. There were some people still there that didn't have gloves. There were some people there who didn't have coats. There were people there that had five tanks of propane and someone that had none. There were tents left there. The people didn't leave. They left to get warm. They were going up to the casino to take showers, to come back down, to regroup. We dug people out. It started to formulate a nice little community that I believe today, I have many friends that are still up there that I'm keeping in touch with, many tribal leaders that I'm keeping in touch with. We're trying to set up individual funds now to separate tribes, which I didn't know the first time I was there. Second time I was there, I realized there's security for each tribe. There's so many different tribes there. And everyone is trying to take care of their own family, as if you had a family, you had a family, and also as a community. And I think it's growing into a nice thing. I think donations can't stop. I think you find someone on the ground. It's hard to get in touch with people because of the connections. So if we can try to get people on the ground, if we can try to get emails or people that are going to try to get information back, they are strong. They're stronger than ever. They're getting more organized. I think Royce Gay, when I left, just brought up a new drone. Think they need Phantom 4 drones. Just brought up a new drone there that is trying to get out everything that's going on. It just saddens me that an experience that has been positive and everybody all together trying to make something positive out of it, because, and I hate to say it, I was in media first. I'm a physical therapist. I was in media first years ago. Getting back into it gives misinformation out. I have seen these films several times, and I have shared them, and I have to commend all of you on these films. These films are wonderful, and we've been sharing them like crazy. So you're getting out the truth. I love it. Young Turks also. Jordan, good friend of mine. He's not up there anymore. He's in Texas now with that pipeline. But what I'd like you guys to get out, because you have all the equipment to do so, they need people. They just need people who can take care of them. So it's freezing up there. It's, I am best on the ground here in New York to help them. I have names of people. If anyone wants to talk to me later, I have individual groups. They need things. I have tribal leaders, the elders. They're proud. They need things. They can't sit out in this weather, and they still need individual money to go to them. They cannot work like the younger people can. So that's my experience there. I would say anybody who want to go, please go. It's an experience that you're never ever going to have again in your life. I came back. It's my second home. I long to go back. I don't like the cold, but my heart aches because I left part of it there. I'm not going to say I have nightmares, but I do wake up at the night and I still see Enos Poor Bear's face, which is an elder who is from South Dakota with a Cooney Dog Camp as well. And he needs money just to get up to the casino to take a shower. He has nothing in his tent. Meanwhile, we have donations that are stuck somewhere in Bismarck. We need people to get on the ground, to get out in those warehouses and get the donations out. I was there when they were trying to push people off the road. They're still up there with snowmobiles trying to push people off the road. I went into Bismarck. People asked me where I'm going. I had to make up a story that I was going to Washington State. They don't like us up there. They don't want us up there. Discrimination is worse now, ever since the announcement with the Army Corps came out, because now they have nothing to lose. So a lot of the people that are going from the camp and the natives themselves, they can't get up there to buy long johns. They can't get up there to go into town to get their mail because they're being harassed. So, if anybody can get up there or send donations and you can send it to individual people, please do. Don't have them turn you away. Solidarity is still strong there. So.
Cool, thanks. Thanks for the organizers for doing this. My name is Will, and I hail from Ute Territory in northern Utah. And I was out at Standing Rock for the last 4 months, working mainly in infrastructure and logistics. I've been working with a lot of these people for a number of years now on these different interrelated infrastructure fights that are happening kind of from Canada all the way down to Texas. And I just kind of want to give some context, kind of the bigger picture here, because I think it really helps kind of clarify what's happening here. So for the last more than a decade, we've seen kind of an emergence of a number of infrastructure fights around North America, primarily around fossil fuel infrastructure, but also I think uranium is also really important, that especially coming from where I come from, where uranium mining is a pretty big deal. But what we're seeing is this kind of shift both in dealing with climate change and dealing with fossil fuel infrastructure expansion, kind of the growth of this unconventional fossil fuel. This is fracking, this is tar sands, right? Comes mostly out of the Energy Policy Act of the Bush administration. And when they read the writing on the wall, they understand that, like, with the context of climate change and with transitions in energy markets, there is going to be a shift happening. But if they can build out a lot of this infrastructure very quickly, then for decades we're going to be locked in for this little bit. And it's also no coincidence that a number of these projects are occurring on indigenous land. And so we've been seeing this constellation across Turtle Island or North America of this. You can look at things like the Unistoten camp, who for 7 years have been blockading pipelines up in unceded Wet'suwet'en territory, or things like the resistance to the Keystone Pipeline, which in a lot of ways kind of laid the foundation for a lot of this. And this is where a lot of these relationships were built, both between tribal nations, direct action groups, and campaigns like the tar sands blockade down in Texas were kind of some of the first iterations of this. But what we saw at Standing Rock was kind of a growth and kind of like an unprecedented level of resistance there. And I think one of the important contexts there is that we're seeing this failure of institutions across Turtle Island, both political institutions dealing with the issues of our time, whether that's climate change, racial justice, prisons, et cetera. And the only thing that are moving these things forward are grassroots direct actions and grassroots direct action movements, right? And so literally the pipeline was supposed to be pumping right about now. And if everything had gone on without the resistance, that oil would be flowing right now. And so I think that the direct action that we saw on the pipeline route, directly getting in the way of the pipeline's infrastructure and their logistic flows, was a key part of what has created this kind of temporary victory right now. And, when my friends, kind of like, ask, was this a victory, that sort of thing, I think it's more of a pause than a victory right now. And I think it's really important to give a little context to that, particularly where this was happening. So this camp happens at the confluence of the Cannonball Rivers and the Missouri Rivers. The reason that they call it the Camp of the Sacred Stones is because many years ago, the whirling vortex would create these huge orb stones that were a part of ceremony and a big part of people's identity there. That all changed in '44 under the Pick-Sloan Act, which was kind of the first entrance of the Army Corps of Engineers into kind of this political world right here. After initial colonization, many of what's called the Great Sioux Nation, or Lakota, Dakota, Nakota people were pushed west of the Missouri, but then were flooded out once again many years later. And that's a living memory. You'll see in community meetings, elders get up and talk about how their grandparents stood in the doorway of their house as the floodwaters rose in resistance to the Army Corps of Engineers. So the Corps of Engineers has a long history there, and I think it's really important to contextualize the win that happened there, where the Army Corps was forced through direct action, through popular political pressure, to recognize the sovereignty and autonomy of the Standing Rock people. And I think that should never be diminished, even though there is a very real possibility that the pipeline will be continued under the next administration. Which brings me to another really important point. As you can kind of see from some of these pictures, kind of the bleakness of what it's like when the police state completely takes off its gloves. And that's what we saw in North Dakota. And there's a long history of white supremacy, of resource exploitation and colonization there. This is the racism of what Winona LaDuke calls the Deep North, right? And if you haven't been to Dakota and experienced it, it's really a shocking thing. It's a very active sort of colonization. And one image that I think will stay with me forever is during the raid on the 1851 treaty camp that was on the pipeline route. You had these cops coming forward, literally swinging and beating elders, tasing people in the face. I work as a medic up there, and we just dealt with grievous injuries for months up there. But literally right behind the cop line, the DAPL bulldozers were bulldozing grave sites, and you could see it right behind it. And so kind of the ideology of the cops is protecting and serving public safety, as Sheriff DAPL or Kirchmeier talks about. You can kind of see kind of the naked power of what colonial reality is in this country, and kind of the continuity of that, which is, I think, in the stories that are being told about this, one of the key stories is that honoring that indigenous resistance that has been happening for generations upon generations. And you see this to extent in the film, but some of the more incredible things, like them taking out Custer's gun to remind them that they have defeated the army before, and they're willing to fight and do incredible things to defend that water. It was very humbling, to say the least, to be there, to understand this lineage of history and struggle that I think a lot of us can learn a lot from. And part of that is being able to directly confront state power. It was there. Prayer and peaceful protests were a big part of the narrative that was created on this, but every day there is direct action happening. There were people are getting in the way of the cops, getting in the way of the pipeline workers. And that it was very difficult to see, and you saw it in bits and pieces. And I think a lot of props go out to the independent filmmakers like Kanahus, who was featured there, West Coast Women's Warrior Cooperative, Unicorn Riot, like a number of community-based media institutions that were getting that story out, because that sort of direct action, I think, speaks to the reality of what's coming in the next couple years, which is I think one of the key lessons on this is, how do we fight as a grassroots army when political institutions have failed? How do we intervene in the flows of capital? How do we intervene in the actual logistical building of these projects all around? Because that's what we're going to see in the coming years, is kind of the multiplication of Standing Rock here, the ripple effects of this, where hundreds and thousands of people were touched by this and have now the experience of standing together and facing off with the cops, facing off with these companies, of running these media campaigns that were having to kind of combat the smear campaign and kind of the terrorist brush that they wanted to sweep over people. And that's really important. And I think it's also really important, the solidarity that's happening from coastal cities, both materially in terms of media, that continues, not just for Standing Rock and whatever comes in the next wave of that struggle, but also to the emergent struggles that are happening all around, like pipeline struggles in Arkansas, struggles in Diné-Biquet, my own homeland, where people are fighting new uranium mines, new tar sands mines, new fracking operations, and that we get really good at creating these networks of support and care and material support that exist all across the continent to be able to directly intervene into the flows of capital. And in doing so, perhaps take an important lesson about our own role and place on this land and what it means to live here ethically and what it means to live in common with each other in the sort of world that we might want to see, you can see kind of take place in these camps. And for the 4 months that I was there, it was a very different existence where, if a car got stuck, I'd go to ThunderClan across the street because their big ass truck could haul anything out. When like the elders across the other street needed some water, or wood or whatever it was, there was a much different sort of rhythm of life. The value of what life was worth there was much different. And I think these experiences in blockading capital, blockading their world and unleashing our own, as one saying goes, I think does have a great deal of descriptive power of this. But I think in kind of this moment of pause that we're having right now, it's really worth to have really deep reflections on what we learned here and, most importantly, what comes next. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much, Will, and thanks, Rebecca, and everyone for organizing this and coming, and everyone for sharing. Like I said, I'm Matt, and we went again in September and right around Thanksgiving, and we left right around the announcement. And myself and Vanessa and Sham, who traveled together both times, put together just some brief thoughts or kind of observations to talk about, to kind of put forth here. But we also just look forward to hearing what other people are interested in. Primarily what we wanted to talk about or think about is kind of this recent phase, because maybe we could think of like these 3 phases or something in the spring of like April, May, June, where it's primarily kind of youth from the tribe and reservation who are kind of holding down this ceremonial camp. Then maybe July, August, September, when it really becomes a national story, which is when we first went. And then this kind of recent phase of October, November, December, this kind of shift towards winterization and a kind of increased intensity that the police kind of repression kind of steps up. So we primarily wanted to talk or think or reflect about our recent trip and some of this last phase, but maybe people have questions or interest just about the entirety or whole scope of it. But we got there right around this kind of, what was at the time a kind of climax of attendance or participation around Thanksgiving, when we think we've heard there was maybe around 10,000 people at the camp. And when we had been in September, there was maybe 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 people, and we were like, wow, this is huge and crazy. And then we get back in like Thanksgiving and it's like tripled. And we're like, wow, this is really totally nuts, And I think that kind of being followed then by this veteran mobilization, despite the temperature, the kind of extremity of the weather, the storms, just the duration of the movement in general that had been going on 6, 7, 8 months, this kind of public statement that they want to evict the camp by, I think, December 5th, this threat of a siege that the governor puts out that he's not going to no longer allow any more supplies or people into the camp. The main highway accessing the camp from Bismarck was blockaded at that point for quite a while. So all of these things that theoretically should have led to the camp diminishing or shrinking or no longer being there basically failed, and the camp was just getting bigger. despite the weather, despite the kind of time, despite everything, the siege, the legal threats, the kind of, even this water cannon kind of act, which was totally heinous, people just keep flooding in. And I think basically this veterans thing that I'm curious to hear more about was really the kind of, a kind of climax in some way in terms of the narrative, which was really this looming threat of like, what the fuck's gonna happen when these thousands of veterans come in? Both tactically within the camp, there's a lot of curiosity about this possibility of storming this bridge blockade with the veterans. You know, are the police and National Guard and everyone's security going to attack the veterans the same way they had attacked Native people? And what would that look like in a media kind of world? But also just, you know, these tactical things. So I think all of this, basically, it seemed to us, led to the fact that they just kind of called it off or backed off and led to this kind of political victory, if you will, of the Army Corps not wanting to see what would happen if you kind of went there. Another kind of point to think about is just within the veteran thing, and just to think more about that, that there was already this militarized sense of what was happening at Standing Rock, both from the presence of the National Guard, this kind of this checkpoint that was set up, both the equipment of the police and security forces that was incredibly militarized, this blockade that has all this kind of barbed wire and trucks and tanks and all of these things, the water cannon, obviously, and even just to think of this veteran identity, you know, many of the Native peoples who have been occupying Standing Rock that were themselves already veterans. You know, Native people serve in the military and the armed forces at a higher rate, given their proportion within the population, and many, even alongside this kind of warrior identity, part of that is also related to their service in the kind of armed forces, which they obviously have mixed feelings about or something, but there was already kind of thousands of veterans there even before this kind of veteran mobilization. And I think it was an interesting dynamic, like even people that we were camping with kind of were kind of excited or happy about the veteran thing, and we didn't know that they were veterans, but they pulled out their kind of veteran hats and stuff like this. And that was just kind of interesting. Another thing to talk about maybe is, to some extent, the kind of anticlimax, actually, of the announcement of the Army Corps' kind of statement, even though what had been seen like on Facebook or in the national media as this kind of heroic, celebratory moment, within the camp, from what we understand, what we kind of saw was a kind of subdued skepticism, that there actually wasn't this celebratory moment of like, oh, we won. But like people kind of explained to us, and we kind of, you know, heard that actually people were kind of not kind of cheering and roaring all night or whatever. People were kind of a little muted or something. And I think that's interesting. And also to think about how the media itself can construct these moments of affect or like celebration or victory, or like even to kind of create its own narrative of the movement, where it's like, okay, you won, like go home, like it's over. Even if in the camp no one thinks that or feels like that, but the media itself or even Facebook can create this kind of image. I think another interesting thing related to the media and just related to the kind of duration and persistence and resilience of the movement is the extent to which that DAPL kind of basically lost public opinion. And, you know, most of the media kind of coverage was based on these confrontations, which increasingly the state looked excessive. And, you know, in the case of the dogs, very early on in September, the dog attacks of the people by private security, and leading obviously to the climax of the water cannons, you know, and freezing temperature, was just totally indefensible. And I think more and more they were kind of losing this battle, and even the governor of North Dakota himself talked about how the media just made it so difficult. But like Will was saying, locally it's interesting because we've also heard or read polls within Bismarck or North Dakota. If you ask people there, they'll be like, oh, the Indians are violent, or they're kind of a nuisance, or it's their fault, or they're causing this conflict. So there is this dynamic of like the local kind of population of North Dakota or non-native population versus just the national kind of public sentiment. So I think that's a kind of interesting dynamic. Just a kind of general point that very much the movement was based within the 7 council fires, you know, the Oceti Sakowin, which is the main camp. What it's named after is the councils of the Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota people. Very much, in particular, the Lakota people of Standing Rock, and even more in particular, the Oglala Lakota, who are largely from Pine Ridge, very much made up the kind of backbone and foundation of the camp. Their families who are kind of committed themselves to living and moving at the camp and supporting each other, but at the same time, it was only really possible through the broader solidarity and circulation of other tribal members and other non-native allies or whatever, including the so-called weekend warriors who would kind of flood the camp. And kind of elevate the numbers on the weekend, but that was kind of welcome because they would bring supplies, much needed supplies. They had cars, they were able to drive back and forth. So on the weekends, we kind of saw like, oh, the extended families coming in and bringing things, and that was totally necessary and helpful. You know, there's lots of stories on the media of like, oh, don't go. If you can't go for 6 months, you know, don't bother. But like people were there, they were like, oh, I'm just grateful that people came and just wanted to talk or wanted to listen. You know, obviously people shouldn't go and like go with nothing and no preparation or no experience or skills or resources. But at the same time, there was a kind of welcoming spirit within the movement of people wanting, and like the kind of curiosity was very much embraced. Within this kind of Lakota foundation of the movement, I think one of the ways that's kind of made up is within these extended families and networks, which is kind of referred to as like Tioshpai within the Lakota language, which is very much the kind of broader kind of social organization or form within which it exists. And these are people that already knew and trusted each other, had a multi-generational relationship within each other. They had roles within their kind of extended family of who would do what within their camps, within these sub-camps. And I think it was these extended families that really stabilized the movement, that stabilized the camps, that kind of knew how to live together, that had like lived, you know, the Lakota people that we had camped with, they were like, we know how to live in the wilderness. We know how to live in this weather. We know how to camp. We know how to live outside. We know how to find and cut and use wood for fire. You know what I mean? We know how to do this. But at the same time, like, we didn't come here to camp. We can camp where we live. We came here to block the pipeline. So this was a kind of interesting dynamic or tension, maybe we could say, towards this last phase where because of the highway blockade, a lot of the tactical operations were kind of blocked or kind of foreclosed upon because you no longer could actually get to the pipeline construction to block it. So people were kind of left simply to camp. And to some extent, that's still the case or whatever, that people can kind of only camp. So there is this kind of different dynamic, but I think, you know, the people from the area with these kind of networks know how to live and can live and have their kind of roles or something. Another recent experience is as the temperature and weather kind of increased, basic just circulation within the camps, the encampment became a little difficult. So there was kind of some less meetings. People kind of really stayed within their tent or within their camp, and we're just focused on kind of survival mode, like where are we going to get wood, where are we going to get water, where are we going to get food. We have to chop that wood, start fires, cook, you know, find water. The days actually became quite short. You know, it would get dark around 4:30 while we were there, basically. So it's a very short day. Before you know it, you know, you've eaten, had breakfast, maybe did a round, had lunch, and then it's dark. You know what I mean? So there's a kind of different rhythm or temporality of like what that would create. And for better or worse, that also kind of facilitated people staying within their camps or within their networks. It kind of maybe foreclosed the random possibility of just chance encounter or just random meetings or assemblies that we saw more so in September when people were just wandering around and meeting each other and talking. One interesting dynamic we noticed on the recent trip is something like a kind of downtown was created within the main camp, like right when you would come in by the main kind of sacred fire or the main meal halls or whatever, or the main supply things. This is more where you saw a lot of non-native people or white people who kind of came themselves or individually, maybe without kind of broader networks or without contacts or something. And somehow, kind of like in the city or something, like in New York, I mean, people would kind of gather in this downtown, and some of the mess halls were almost like entirely non-native, whereas you had on the outskirts these kind of people living with their families, living in community in the kind of suburbs or something like that. And somehow you had very little interaction between people living in community or native families and this kind of downtown. And in some ways it was kind of interesting that this was happening, but in some ways kind of problematic in the way that the city could be kind of problematic, like this kind of lack of exchange or kind of dialogue, or like people in some of the kind of further out encampments that people were living with their families or whatever, would never go to these mess halls where these kind of like maybe hippies or something were just gathering just with other hippies or whatever. So that was just to put that out there. And maybe I can stop for now. We can talk more, you know, in the general discussion or something, but these are just some things I think we all wanted to put out there.
I'm Vanessa. I went with Matt both of the time, so we've shared a lot of the experiences. But I guess the second time, as he said, was really like full of events because we arrived there the day after Thanksgiving. So we encountered that first impression of actually seeing the amount of people, of how the camp has increased despite the weather. But it was also like a few days after the eviction was announced. So there was also a lot of preparation of this might be real. Like we need to get cars, we need to prepare, we need to have a plan. A lot of the people who we met, that I met through Matt last trip, had actually gone back to their houses and brought their kids. So there was a lot of more like a family environment in the camp that we noticed. And for that reason also, like the preparations for like a possible eviction or just like actually needing wood, needing food, needing water bottle and propane tanks was actually like, we actually do need this now. So some of the friends that we were spending time like that weekend, they needed a car. They had to get a car. So it was just interesting to see like how immediate the needs are because of how real they are and like how the fear and the danger, you can feel it. And also on that moment, there was also like this funny comment on the response to the governor when the Army Corps of Engineers took back the eviction, but then it was took over by the governor that said like, oh, it's because we're concerned for the people because of the weather conditions. And as Matt was saying, like most of these groups, through Sundance and through ceremony and through all these very deep experiences they share, they know how to live through the winter and through the different elements and through the different seasons. So their reply was that considering that the governor and the whole structure are newcomers, it's normal that they would be concerned about the weather, but they know how to live in the weather. So that was also kind of interesting to see those responses and like just that reality of like the settlers and those concerns and the excuses of being concerned with the people when just a few weeks before they were attacked with water tanks in below freezing temperatures. What else I think that it was different from the things that changed. I think that also something that I want to share because it's very close to my heart is like how this has echoed some other struggles that are going through. I'm from Ecuador, and today one of the mining camps that was taken over by the shore community a few weeks ago has seen a huge militarization today. And it's just like coming back what you were saying, Will, that this is not something new of how like energy plants and mining camps and oil drilling are actually going for indigenous ancestral lands, and that's not a coincidence. And it's being seen like, as you said, all around Turtle Island, but also throughout South America. And I think about the media, also what we were sharing, like we left the day that we received the news, but we left before. And just like the idea that we experienced of seeing like this victory when it was actually not how it was being experienced there, but it made us experience even there, like after some hours, how the whole manipulation happens and how it's so easy to get to buy it. So yeah, but thank you.
So my name is Matt Howard. I'm one of the co-directors of Iraq Veterans Against the War with Maggie Martin. We had a delegation of folks that headed out to Standing Rock in probably around, I think folks started getting out there November 18th, something like that. And I drove with another member who couldn't unfortunately be here from New York, Eli Wright, who was a combat medic in the Army and served in Iraq. And so we drove from New York with a bunch of gear. We picked up a military tent along the way in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and then landed in Standing Rock around the 23rd, I think it was, the 22nd and the 23rd. When we got into Oceti Sakowin, the main camp, I think we both kind of experienced this moment of kind of almost this like almost physical sensation of being in a place that felt really familiar, in the sense that the militarization around the camp, the concertina wire, the barricades, the helicopters that were buzzing overhead really, frequently, the floodlights that DAPL had installed on the hills that you can see in some of those pictures. For both of us, we kind of like looked at each other and had this sense of going back to Iraq, going back to a forward operating base out there. And the very first thing that we linked up with our folks that had already kind of set up camp, and went to the vets tent to link up with folks there. And the very first thing they said was, okay, you guys are vets. Hey, a bunch of, militarized looking white dudes came in a bunch of unmarked cars. Go find them and keep them there if you find them. It's like, holy shit. Well, so, I think that it very quickly, I think as a lot of folks have said, there's like a sense of a very different rhythm of life. What I say this piece about the militarized, the kind of militarized, especially northern part of the camp next to the bridge, but that was not the case inside of the camp, right? And I think that's like as has been demonstrated already. I think there was a lot of things that were really beautiful. What I kind of have told folks is that my experience was that I had no touch point for any of it, over and over and over again. And I'm, that's not the case for me all that frequently. And so I think that, our folks very quickly, we connected with some of our allies with the Indigenous Peoples Power Project, and the Grassroots Global Justice Alliance, who had a delegation. But as we were kind of coming up there, we started to hear about this veterans mobilization. And to be honest, that wasn't on our radar. And as we read the op order, and op order is kind of a military who, what, where, when, why, we're like, a number of us were feeling pretty uncomfortable about it, to be 100% honest. Because for some of us, I felt like there was a sense of like, this does feel a little bit militarized. It does feel like there are a lot of X factors here that could not work out. And if I was DAPL, I would throw 50 vets into the midst of there as infiltrators and screw a lot of shit up for people. And so I think the more that we thought about it and the more we realized the timing about it, the kind of sense of serendipity, hey, we already have a number of folks here, we started to think, actually, we should stay. Because there are warrior societies out here that are holding it down from the different nations, but we might be one of the few groups of organized vets out here. So we put the call out pretty quickly to our members, like, let's join this. And we had, and interestingly, I kind of feel like Standing Rock, for a lot of folks, not just our community, is kind of like this nerve bundle that got touched, and it kind of electrified a network, because we had folks that had been really involved in IVAW in the past and kind of had taken a break from it who showed up. We had new folks that had never been involved in IVAW who showed up, which was, I think, really incredible. And obviously, I don't know the last time that many veterans have shown up to anything political since maybe as far back as the Bonus Army back in the 20s. That's probably not true, at least, since the 70s with VVAW. And so I think that we basically started to build relationships with folks on the ground, relationships that we either already had or that folks kind of introduced us, and connect to the headsmen, the Oceti Sakowin headsmen, and some representatives from the tribe. And it was very clear that at that point that the desire was, we don't want to necessarily send a bunch of people in kind of haphazardly to take a hill. we actually want to kind of dial some of that back. And I think that, I think it was Dave who was talking about trauma. Faith Spotted Eagle, who's an elder, who I think had, really held some amazing space and kind of touched upon the fact that there was this kind of linked trauma, or at least an understanding of trauma, both for indigenous communities, but also for the veterans that were there, right? And, I think that who knows, it's hard to know what would have happened if the blizzard hadn't taken place. But I think that, and I think that for some veterans, which I can understand, there was a sense of frustration because people did want to be in service by using their bodies, right? And that can play out in a whole lot of different ways. And I think that part of how we understood our role to be is to support in the ways that leadership there, Native leadership, really envisioned us to be there. Whether that was de-escalatory or whatever that looked like. And, I think that myself and a few other folks stayed for about 2.5 weeks. And, as has been touched on, when the easement was declared denied, I think there was the kind of uneasy sense, and we decided to leave a stay behind crew. And after the blizzard, we helped evacuate people that weren't prepared. And our stay behind folks who were kind of helping, supporting, cleaning up, and doing various things, realized pretty quickly that that the wishes of the elders in the camp was that if you're not 100% ready to stay here in these conditions, like maybe it's not a good idea to be here. In the sense of how that can play out for just the kind of collectivity. And we still have a few folks there that have been there for months and really have been supporting more as individuals. But I think that I think for a lot of our people, it was a really profound experience. I think people who came in as deep atheists had experiences they wouldn't have expected. I think that that it has got the gears going for me a lot about what our role is in future things like this. But what about Standing Rock is an example that we need to take into different communities, and be building our future work around the sense of political vision, the sense of solidarity, things like that. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Julie. I'm currently living in New York, but originally from Florida, and I am involved with Paper Tiger Television. So I went out there with Aneeta and some other people kind of right around this on Thanksgiving Day. So I kind of experienced a lot of the Thanksgiving surge, I guess. And then I was there for, I guess, until the next Friday. So you could definitely see right around Sunday, so many people just started leaving. And I definitely agree with what one of you all were saying about how it's so great to get new people in there and get people to support. But I think I definitely experienced a lot of the conflicts and tension that was also bringing. A lot of people going in for just a few days, maybe they're unprepared. I wasn't really fully prepared for how cold it was going to be. And so that just really is also a drain of resources. And so I think it is good for people to go and definitely go, but be prepared. And maybe to just, if anyone is thinking about going maybe after the winter, to just consider how much are you spending, or don't fundraise for yourself. Maybe you can donate money to the camps and to support people there. So that's something that I experienced. I guess people have said a lot, so I won't say so many things. But one thing that was really powerful was just the community that has been created there by folks who have been there for months since the spring. It's such a warm and welcoming and supportive place. You can just go and talk to anyone, and there's such a level of respect that people have for each other, whether you're there for a short amount of time or whether you've been there. Respect is very important. I think since we were there at this like interesting time where it was like after the extreme repression, but before kind of the easement was denied. There was a lot of definitely preparing for evictions in the camp, so there weren't so many actions. But I think that also, since there weren't so many actions going on, it kind of allowed a lot of time for discussion and connecting with people. There was a lot of really great work being done around like thinking about colonization and what does that mean for people who live in this land and who are like a part of settler colonialism. So every night they would have a discussion in this like main dome area where sometimes hundreds of people would go, and they'd go around and just kind of everyone would ask questions and talk about like, you know, what is our role in settler colonialism? How are we complicit? What privileges do we have? All sorts of things. What does it mean to decolonize? What does that look like? So I think, you know, there's really important work that's going on because this community has come together. And another thing that I would say is important is there's definitely a focus on like centering Indigenous voices all the time, because those are the people who have started this, who have been there. And so as someone who's coming just for 1 week, it was very nice to see like that's being thought about all the time. And you know, sometimes people don't say the right thing or center whiteness a lot, and there's definitely like people calling that out and having discussions saying like, no, it's not about that. Let's see. I guess one other thing is thinking about how we can help as people who are not there or who live in New York or other places. Definitely donating is important, raising money, having fundraisers, having conversations like this, participating or organizing actions around like divesting and the banks. Those are things we can all do here, to get involved in Indigenous struggles where we live and to find out like whose land are we on right now? Are there struggles we can participate in? Are there other pipeline struggles that we can, you know, go and be a part of? So yeah, maybe we can talk about like ways forward and things we can do in solidarity in the larger discussion. Do you want to go first?
Hey all, I'm Aneeta. I also went with Julie, like Julie just said. Yeah, everyone has talked a lot about very similar, akin experiences. I think what was something that was really a place of like pause and thoughtfulness, even before entering the camp, is who we are as as people, as guests of Indigenous folks, of Oceti Sakowin people, of a group of folks that have been struggling since April for a pipeline to be stopped. So what does it mean to go in with a decolonial perspective? What does it mean to replenish as much as you're taking, as much as you can prepare for North Dakota winter? You know, you're outside the entire time doing work and doing and being a part of meetings. And so I think it was definitely difficult as someone from California and not with like that history. And so constantly I was thinking over and over again, how can I be of service? How can I be of service? I'm on Indigenous land. How can I be of service? And I think that that needs to happen kind of all the time versus just like when I'm very clearly and blatantly a part of an Indigenous struggle. I think wherever we are, Indigenous struggle exists because of the colonial relationship that this country has to Indigenous communities, and the erasure of Indigenous communities. So like we might not be in constant communication in community with Indigenous folks where we live right now, but that they're here and their struggles continue over here as well. And like how a lot of people have said, how can we engage where we are and go when we are called to go to struggles far from where we are. Yeah, there was something in the like rest period of the police and military repression that happened on Sunday, and before like the vets came and like before the easement happened was like these decolonizing processes, these conversations, and I think that was coming from thanks taking and lots of people coming in and like trash being spewed, maybe not as much as maybe like a concert, but like definitely like the vibe was different, right? And like, we had just come, and so this is just like based off of what people had talked to us about and the conversations that we got to be a part of, was that like, some people came in and took whatever they needed to take to get that experience, to get that learning. And a lot of these decolonial discussions were about like, if you're coming here to just learn, like that's where your privilege is. Like your privilege is that like you get to be so removed that this is like a learning experience for you. And it's not around like, it's not deeply around like service and like how to make this camp stronger, how to be really in deep solidarity with the needs of Indigenous communities that have been there. So yeah, that was the constant reminders of decolonization and how like far we are from it, to be really real, like that people can come into like a decolonizing struggle essentially, right? That Indigenous sovereignty is being demanded, and people can come into this struggle as non-Indigenous people and not have any framework about colonization, not have any historical frameworks whatsoever, and can use the language of universality as a way to disregard the really different experiences that folks of color, Indigenous folks, folks that live in the margins constantly experience. So that was a lot of labor, and how much labor that Indigenous folks have to carry, just like they have to carry the labor of like having direct but compassionate confrontations with like non-native folks coming in, just wanting to like take and not replenish, wanting to like ask questions about like what is privilege, or oh well, we're all the same. Well, you should have done your homework before you came to an Indigenous struggle, and so like they have to like do that labor, and then the labor of like the elders, like the Native elders, having different tactics than like maybe Indigenous youth, and like that sort of kind of labor that's always happening. And then obviously like the state struggle, the confrontation between the state and that constant fear and labor that Indigenous folks over there have to deal with. And that's just so many layers, and how much can folks hold. And I think keeping that in mind always is will humble you, and also will compel us to keep doing as much as we can to stop pipelines, but also to be in alignment with Indigenous communities. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Nguyen. I am also a member of IVAW, This was my first action. True and firm believer of everything happens for a reason. I found about Standing Rock probably in September or October. Just seeing all the videos, it really upset me, especially Thanksgiving. So I flew into Minneapolis and I met another member. We couldn't fly directly into Bismarck because of the roadblocks. So we drove from Minneapolis there, and we had to take a detour to come from the south, and just stopping along the way to get supplies and everything that we needed. We had a lot of different people ask us, oh, are you going to Standing Rock? Because it was an Asian person with a Caucasian lady, and she was a lot older, so it looked really suspicious. And we also came with a Marine, and so he looked suspicious. So it was just like really awkward. Fortunately, we were like, oh, we're just going hiking. Totally obvious, you know? Like, we're definitely lying. I'm just like, oh my God, this feels weird. There's like no other minorities in South Dakota right now. But finally, we get to Standing Rock on the 2nd, and I had a lot of anxiety. I was worried about, you know, the veterans coming from Standing Rock. Veterans stand for Standing Rock. I was a little anxious, like, I didn't know what to expect. Definitely didn't want anybody to get hurt. You put a bunch of veterans together, they get a little crazy, you know, even if they have good intentions. I just remember after my 2nd day, that's whenever a lot of the veterans start showing up, and just driving around the camp, we had to go get firewood. It made me really, I like started crying just because I was very overwhelmed. It went from a lot of people to a lot of fucking people. Like, it was just, you know, a cluster. But fortunately, we had a veterans meeting, and the elders were like, we're not going to do any actions. We're going to move forward with peace and peace and prayer. And so just looking around the room, a lot of the veterans, there were some that was kind of like, they were disappointed. But I didn't care about that. I was just happy that, you know, we were going to be peaceful. And so after that, like a few days later, the blizzard hit, kind of not happy about cold, but then also like glad because that pushed a lot of the veterans to leave. It's just, my whole experience with Standing Rock was amazing. I cannot express it enough. Like, if you go there, you always want to go back. Like, it's like something draws you back. It's, I don't know, it's sacred, you know? You just feel it in your blood, like just being there. Just, if you go to Standing Rock, make sure you're really, really prepared. And not only that, please share your experiences with anybody that will listen to you. It needs to get out. The fight is so not over, you know. I just remember when the Army Corps of Engineers, you know, put out the announcement, I had a lot of people put on my Facebook, oh, you guys won. I'm like, we didn't win anything, you know. This is just a small battle that we overcame, you know. But just like encouraging people to get out of their bubble. I'm not gonna lie, I was in a bubble, you know, I was just happy, didn't know what it was really, just trying to like stay ignorant and pretend like the world is perfect, but it's not. Like, just Standing Rock, and just now even with Corpus Christi, with the water that's happening close to home, that's where I'm from, is Texas. It's just, everybody needs to stand up and fight. And just being at Standing Rock, like everybody coming together was amazing. I would be in my tent, and at 11 o'clock at night, you could just hear people, hey, do you need any help? Hey, do you need any help? Like, it really brings you like a sense of community and just gives you like a sense of purpose again, to give you like that hope in people again, especially with the election and being from a red state. Like, I was really pissed off, you know? Just, it's so incredible. I mean, always definitely to leave more than you take. Don't come to Standing Rock because you think that it's gonna be fun so that you can have Instagram photos. You know what I mean? Go there to help, take your skills, use your voice, you know? Sorry, I'm gonna keep it short and sweet. I'm a little nervous. But that's it. That's all I can really give to you guys.
I do want to open it up to questions from the audience. I just have a quick question for the veterans who are out there. Watching from New York, I know a lot of us did, and seeing, you know, thousands of veterans going out was just like a monumental, like, it was huge, you know, and so I really am grateful that you guys did that and that you're here to speak. And I also noticed that it was like a day or two after when they announced that the easement had been denied. how direct, of a connection or not do you think it was, your presence being there, and that announcement?
I think that obviously it's anyone's guess. I mean, I think that what we have tried to center is that this victory of a small battle is very much, because of the indigenous resistance that Standing Rock is and continues to be. I think from a standpoint of in the escalation that we've seen, that our experience in IVAW in the past has been that police are not real keen on beating up veterans. It doesn't look very good. There becomes sometimes a question of a kind of it puts them in a crisis moment where they're really questioning what they're doing, because a lot of cops are formerly veterans or have connections to the military. I wasn't there personally. I had just got out of the military, but in 2008, a number of our folks, about 60 of our folks, marched down to the DNC and kind of faced off with the cops, and were kind of talking to them in ways that they could relate to, as being like, saying essentially over megaphones, we know what it's like to be on that side of the line. We know what it's like to question what you're doing. We know what it's like to feel that pain in your back when you're wearing, this heavy gear, and you don't have to do this, basically. And that did result in people kind of coming off of the line. So I think that sometimes those confrontations, the state doesn't want that to happen. But I think it's a small piece, and, obviously a much larger struggle and fight. But yeah, I don't know for certain.
You said everything I wanted to say.
Does anybody have a question?
I think as has been touched on before, there is an organized crew of veterans in Standing Rock that continues through the warrior societies from various nations. The camp security, as I understand, is largely led by indigenous veterans. I think that as much as it makes sense, we will continue to have folks out there, and there will be, I can't speak for the large veteran Stand with Standing Rock mobilization, because that's, we had very cursory interactions with them, but by no means are we a part of that larger group. So yeah, I think I would guess that in the ways that there is already organization that's going to continue. And I think that especially as there's a need or a call for folks to be there and to sustain the camp, there will continue to be that.
Yeah, so what we saw in terms of, there's a couple layers of kind of the police repression that were happening there. At the basis level, Morton County was the coordinating sheriff of that. And at a higher level, G4S was a private security organization that was paid for by DAPL to run security. And then other information indicates that an outfit called Tiger Swan was the private intelligence coordinator outfit that did that. And then in a much bigger sense, these emergency management compacts between different states then allowed different jurisdictions to send troopers in to reinforce those ranks. All of those police departments benefit from that program and their experience with military-grade tactics. Vehicles like the MRAP and the Bearcat that we saw out there just reflects this larger reality of militarization that's kind of like the new normal of what we're in right now. But I think there's a couple key cracks in that are really important to reflect on, because it shows where popular power can resist police militarization. So one of those were jurisdictions where the cops were coming from, people would mobilize to demand those cops be sent back. For example, Minneapolis occupied their city hall to demand that Hennepin County pull their sheriffs back, which they then did. Similarly, in Montana, political pressure from the tribes there made sure that cops weren't coming out from there. So I think that that's actually a really important lesson from this, is that there are cracks in the police state, and that we can organize to open those cracks up to make sure that that violence isn't inflicted. I think on another level, this really means that we need to study and understand much better the private intelligence world out there, because that is a reality that's starting to become more and more normal. So companies like G4S, Tiger Swan, Stratfor, the private intelligence company that advises a lot of these oil companies, this is kind of this shadow security apparatus that has been built up in the past decade and more, that is really going to affect the ability of social movements to operate in this country. And we really need to understand the inner workings of those and begin to mobilize to both deconstruct and abolish those institutions.
I think there also was this letter that was sent to Obama by the Morgan County Sheriff asking, like, demanding more presence of federal, with police, like federal army, or, and I think that also just like brings back to like all the different jurisdictions and the great lines of being like a national like a nation, but dependent, and how all has that played out in the conflict. And speaking about territory and how like the eminent domain happened where the occupation is, and like the reservation and all that great line jurisdiction is part of the conflict. I think Matt can talk a little bit more about like the details. I don't know if you want to like.
Yeah, I think it's interesting and speaks to some extent the kind of cowardice of Obama and his administration in not really taking on this issue, because technically the reservation is a federal territory or property or something, so it's not part of Morton County. But then Morton County and then to some extent the state of North Dakota were it was kind of just put in their hands to deal with this crisis or conflict or something without the kind of real participation of the federal government or something. I don't know what that would have looked like or something, but in some ways, obviously Morton County had never dealt with anything like this. It had no conception of what it would mean. And also kind of North Dakota on a state level or something, like technically reservations are not part of the state of North Dakota or the county. They're their own sovereign territory or something like that. And you saw that a little bit with like, so the state or county, couldn't enter onto the reservation, or the kind of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is a federal agency or something, has their own kind of jurisdictional. So there was this kind of jurisdictional clusterfuck, but to some extent kind of points to the kind of lack of vision or leadership from, the Obama administration and his kind of just total avoidance of having to deal with it. The one kind of horrible statement he made where he was kind of pressed on it was like, we're going to let this play out for several more weeks or something, which was just, a real embarrassment. It was similar to his kind of embarrassing kind of performance in Flint when he went to Flint and like drank water. It was maybe one of the most shameful things I've seen, from a president, in my lifetime. Him kind of cowardly drinking this cup of water in Flint. I think similarly, the administration's kind of failure within Standing Rock, is partly, you can see it in these jurisdictional issues and the lack of really anyone wanting to take on these kind of natives or these veterans or something. No one really knew what to do about it. And I think, part of it is these jurisdictional issues to think about, which gets to what you're talking about, these kind of broader settler colonial issues. Who were these territories? What are these traditional territories that exist? What are the reservations that kind of exist that may or may not correspond to traditional, ancestral territories? What are the different kind of administrative lines of county and state and federal kind of jurisdiction? Even within this kind of crazy Bundy thing, this whatever, these kind of jurisdictional issues, who's brought in, what are the kind of legal ways of dealing with these things is kind of quite interesting and might, increasingly come up in this kind of shift towards right-wing kind of authoritarian imaginary of the U.S. and this kind of alt-right European-American kind of conception of the current state of politics or something. I think as, Trump's, vision of, climate change denial and increase wanting to construct, within his 100-day plan, he wants to, part of that is to re-permit the Keystone Pipeline. And, others, obviously, when his administration is in, who knows how they'll relate to these kind of hearings or whatever. So I think, these questions will continue to come up about jurisdiction and sovereignty and contestation of land and infrastructure projects, et cetera.
I just wanted to address someone's question back here regarding having more of the armed forces going in. Something you have to understand is that the Native Americans have they have a mistrust against Caucasian people. They have a mistrust, and rightfully so. They welcome people to come in and help out. They also welcome that day, and I do believe that day did make a difference from everyone that came in. I was there previous to that, and I saw how DAPL security was on the Hill. I saw how they were that night. It was like being in a different country. Not only that, whatever was happening at the bridge, we had actions in Mandan and in Bismarck that didn't get out there in the news, where reporters were getting arrested. They were shoving people on the ground just for being on the bottom of the line, picking people out off the back of the line. A lot of my friends were arrested, spent 72 hours in jail. I still have a friend who didn't get his truck back just for being on the back of the line with a camera, and he unfortunately happened to be in the mall when they closed the door, and he got slammed on the ground. He was filming his own arrest when the camera went down. So what I wanted to mention with that is that all of you did do a great service that day, even though you don't think you did. I think it was a blessing that there was a blizzard, because the Lakota people, they're fearless. And their land is everything, and their life is everything. The respect that they have for this country, for the universe, for every living, breathing thing, they are a peaceful, prayerful people. Nothing happened that night on the bridge. They were dancing as they were being sprayed water cannon, and ice was dripping off of them. They were dancing. I think the police didn't know what to do, because they have a whole different way. It's a whole different language, and they're like, oh, with their singing. And even in New York, Chase Ionize was here just Wednesday and Thursday night in New York. He came from Standing Rock, and they went to the defunct DAPL in New York City, if you happen to be part of that. And the cops in New York didn't know how to respond. They arrested people in Occupy DAPL before. They didn't know how to respond to this group of people who are fearless. And, he's running for congressman. He ran for congressman. And they didn't know what to do. So what I'm trying to say is they welcome everybody to help, but if you go to help, you have to realize it's not your show. That you sit back and you ask, we're here for you. Where do you need us? Do you need me in the kitchen to cook? Do you need me to drive people up and down from the casino? Do you want me to clean out the toilets? Do you want me on the front line as a warrior? What do you want? They want to fight their own fight. They have made that pretty clear. They don't want to be saved from us. They don't want to have, and I had one of this question from one of the tribal leaders that security was being, last time I left, I just got back Tuesday night. So came in a snowstorm, left in a snowstorm. And there was some vets that were at the security that's usually head by CUNY Dog Security. Agaloa, I think, security usually is up at that fence. And I had asked where CUNY Dog was, because I specifically brought Rosebud and Pine Ridge donations specifically for them, because last time they said they didn't have any donations. And they didn't know where they were, because they were kind of new to the, you ask a native, they know. You can ask a native anywhere. Have you seen CUNY Dog? Oh yeah, he just left the casino. He went back down. Oh, he went into town to buy a starter for the car. He's got so I think they feel, in a way, they want people to help, but they want you to be there to help what they want you to do. That it's not our fight. It's not our glory. They do need the bodies in the hands for that. The other thing I wanted to mention was, I don't know if everybody's aware, I think over 500 people were arrested there. Monday morning, I just found out some people I have up there right now, is a court date. The judge has thrown out all videos, any videos, some of the videos of mine in there as well, connected with all these people who are being arrested, to be able to clear themselves. The videos clear them. They're also saying that they want to throw out any statements that about the treaty lands. This is their defense. We have people out there facing federal charges, 45 years in prison. So you're not hearing this in the mainstream media. if you're able to get on social media, and you can try to check out some of the indigenous rising media and so forth, Myron Dewey, some of the other, from Johnny Waters, you can find out all this information. They're looking for support. Please share. Anybody that is able to get up there, anybody that you know in another state that's close, that can get to the courthouse Monday morning and support, or try to call up Morton. I don't know. I can't get back there right now. But this is, I don't know if everybody's knows that this is what's going on right now. So they're saying it's over. It's not. When we were on the camp that night, I think a gentleman here had mentioned about the helicopters going. They were all night, the lights all night. When they called us on the bridge, when the bridge was happening, I just came back from a direct action meeting. I had a friend in town buying vegetables. Somebody else was going buying wood for them. And then boom, there was another action in town. They needed, no actions were supposed to happen that night. And then they were saying they're taking the bridge. And that's when all of that stuff was going on. It was horrific. I've never been in a war before. Probably pretty much close to, I never want to be in that again. Let's put it that way. I felt it was so real that it was not happening. I don't know if it's PSTD. I don't know. I don't think it is, but I still sometimes think that it was. I had an out of body experience. Like this was not. It was something I was watching. That this really was not happening. It's horrific, because even in town, the people will just look at you and like this girl said on the end. Yes, the first caravan I went with 5 people, we had an Asian girl with us, and we had long coats, and it was cold, not as cold as now. And she walked into the store, and the gentleman had said something to her, and we were very close to getting down to 1806 that we had to go. And he mentioned something to her, and she had a wisecrack on the way back. Not for us, not for New Yorkers, but it was just sort of like we all were just like, what you do? Oh my God. And they stared out the window, and we swore to God that we were going to be chased by cops that night. We couldn't get in because there were cops there that night. We went down another road. We told them we were going to the casino. And we had to think of things to say. If we didn't say we were going to a casino, we don't know what would have happened. We don't know. I have a friend that was arrested supposedly for speeding. She's a black woman. They checked everybody's license in the car. Now, you could have said, hey, being from New York or whatever, I'm the driver. You don't have to check. Everybody's butt would have been in jail. And no reason. There's nothing you do up there. It's another country, the way they rule. So just please think of that if you want to help at all, and prayers for everybody there on Monday. Hopefully that will be reversed. But I think you get a lot of stuff from social media. Just keep going on and checking out other sites to try to get everything from basically the Native Americans. A lot of amazing, and everybody here, their stuff has been great. That they've been, your jobs that you're doing is wonderful, getting out the truth. But that's all I want to say.
There's actually kind of like what people are saying. There's a constellation of camps, it behooves you to kind of like do a little bit of research to figure that out, but oftentimes it's very confusing. So it's a good question. For example, like the Sacred Stone Camp was started by LaDonna Brave Bull Allard, and is one of the original ones to start there, and are going to be there throughout the winter. The Oceti Sakowin Camp is there, but like is kind of morphing as to what it is. The warrior camps like High Star or Red Warrior have kind of like scaled back and are still there, but not in full deployment mode right now. And then key infrastructure like the Standing Rock Healers Council and medics is another good way, because they're actually bringing the heaters down and running trucks back and forth of supplies. And so spreading your donations out, and then more than anything trying to be in direct contact with where that goes. Although there's a lot of question on where do these resources go next, and how, what next fights do they flow into, or how are they positioned when perhaps the pipeline goes on at that point. And so more than anything, I think in a bigger sense, develop relationships with people to the best extent possible, whether that's people in your community who are going out there and developing those relationships, because it's oftentimes this constellation where it's not, one nonprofit that's doing everything. And that's probably a good thing because it distributes the resources more kind of across, but sometimes it is confusing as well to try to reach that.
How would we do it if I Google these?
Sure. The Standing Rock Healers Council, you can. It's mostly an online thing. And so if you Google the Oceti Sakowin Camp or the Sacred Stone Camp or the Red Warrior Camp or the High Star Camp,
Oceti Sakowin has changed its name now though, to Oceti Oyata. So just so I don't know if they've gotten
their website just
yeah.
clear it up.
Just
It's Oceti Sakowin still.
It's still Sakowin.
Maybe it's like on the ground. Some people should.
maybe they haven't opened it up
But
yet.
like, it's still on the website, so that would definitely be a place that.
Okay.
And they're known, Oceti Sakowin is known for like being more front lines versus Rosebud is like very like medics and that kind of service, and then Sacred Stone is there's a lot of folks that used to be in the front lines, women and children, and women are still totally in the front lines, not to say that, but like folks that are maybe more vulnerable. They're on like reservation land, like Sacred Stone. There are also like different political things that are happening in Sacred Stone around whiteness. So for me, if I was donating, I would donate to Oceti Sakowin as like a way to be like front lines. There's a lot of need there, as well as a very, very, very strong Indigenous presence there that I, for me personally, did not feel in Sacred Stone. I can't speak to Rosebud because I was not there.
Oceti Sakowin, first of all, is a main camp, the big camp that you see that's right by 1806. Sacred Stone, so everybody knows, Standing Rock, where Sacred Stone, where all this had begun, and when LaDonna had first formed it and the youth went out, and this first started, is that it's the tip of Standing Rock.
Apparently there's kind of this like new colonization that's happening at Standing Rock from from non-Indigenous folks. And then there's comments that are like, oh, well, we're all Indigenous. And it's like, that's the equivalent of like all lives matter, in my opinion, because while that may be true, there is such thing as privilege, and perhaps everybody is Indigenous to some place, but there are real such things as American Indians, and I think that kind of erases it, or like, so I think to kind of answer your question, like, I feel like there is such thing as privilege with white people. How do we talk to white people? How do we wake them up? How do we, that's a huge question that I think a lot of people are asking. And at the same time, I don't feel like it's on people of color or Indigenous people to educate white people. I just don't. I think asking people like people of color to like explain privilege is like a little backwards. It's a little, I hate to say, but it's a little insulting to like be asked to educate a white person on their privilege, or like to say like, hey, it's not really okay to say we're all Indigenous, and it's not really on people of color or Indigenous people to educate white people on that. I think that's up to them. And I think, it's almost like the situation with this is perhaps a stretch, but it's almost the situation with like liberals and people who voted saying, anyway, it's just, that's a whole other thing. I can't, that's a whole, I mean, perhaps I'll pass it on, but what I'm trying to say is, people are either going to get on the train and figure it out, or they're not, and it's not for people who are on that train to try and stop and explain it and whatever. So that's what I got to say about it.
Thanks.
I think that this question that you just raised about like race and ethnicity and whiteness was coming up a lot at Standing Rock. I think because there were a lot of white people who maybe had never thought about that before, because being white in this country, while it's not an ethnicity, it is a real thing, right? And there's power behind it because our system is based in white supremacy. So a lot of people who were there, at least in the time that I was there, who were white people, maybe had the privilege to never have to even think about that question. Because in America, if you're white, like, it doesn't totally matter where you're from because you have the skin color, and so you have certain power and privileges that other folks don't have. So I think that there were discussions going on there about people coming to terms with that, about people trying to figure out, like, where am I from and how did I get here, and coming to terms with, like, the fact that their ancestors participated in colonization and genocide, and, like, maybe, you know, they're an immigrant, maybe their parents came here, so maybe they're not directly involved, but a lot of people are. So there were those kinds of discussions. And I think one of the things that was really, talked about was the need for white people to talk about these things and to kind of articulate them among our white communities, because, like, as Rebecca was saying, people of color have to do this work all the time. They have to experience this daily, and indigenous folks the same, right? So as white people, we need to be able to understand these issues and to, like, take responsibility and speak up and talk to our families or our friends, because there's a lot of work to do. People have, like, totally mixed levels of understanding of their power in this country, and, like, there's a lot of work to do. So I would say I totally agree with you. How do we talk to people about it? And how do we talk about, like, the real history of this country and how this country was founded and the violence that happens every day, still today, throughout the entire time white people came on this continent? So, yeah, I think talking about it is a first step.
And just to, like, go off of what Julie was just saying, even the narrative of, like, if you kind of bring up, like, white supremacy and the origins of, like, colonialism in this country, people can kind of think of it as, like, well, we conquered this land, like, we were the victors, just, like, fair and square, like, yeah, genocide might have happened, but, that's war. We are, like, our patriots, our frontiersmen were the ones that, like, were trying to make a new way, and maybe, like, part of that is, like, people were escaping to come here, but, they brutalized and killed, and really, like, put off the map, so you say, of indigenous people, and to, like, even revert that narrative of, like, what does winning mean when you're an oppressor? What does, like, conquering a land and kind of taking out, like, the patriarchal values of, like, domineering and domination? I think that is also, that's such, like, internal, subtle work that is going to be hard to do, especially for communities like communities that who think themselves white, to disentangle themselves from entitlement of victory and winning and, like, of this land. I think that's just going to be really difficult generational work. And it's going to be super uncomfortable, like, all of the time. So, yeah.
And just going back to what you were saying of, like, the winning-losing kind of narrative, I think that also is related with thinking of colonialism as something that happened, or, like, a certain event that happened at a certain point of time when it's really more about power structures that are still happening, and like we can see it in what is happening in Standing Rock, that is really not at all far from what happened centuries ago. And also from like thinking about privilege and identity, like I'm mixed race, so I have indigenous, and also, so I have like this conflict of being the settler and also being the one who was oppressed. And I think that although that it's more of like how you see, like for me it's also a process of like taking out the settler identity, because it's not my identity. Being a settler is more of like a power structure and how you function on that structure. But knowing the history of how race and color scheme plays on that, and how I have been privileged to like in certain things for my color scheme, that's real. But just like this detaching oneself from thinking of settler as one identity, but seeing that that's also just how you function on that structure and how you can create consciousness and think about, and I don't know, just be more conscious on how you function.
And maybe just quickly to like contextualize a little bit also about Standing Rock, is it's been spoken about as the largest tribal gathering of nations in history since colonization, that the Standing Rock occupation was the single largest gathering of different tribal nations from this hemisphere to come together for a common purpose. And that's obviously an amazing historical feat and accomplishment, but also brought its own complications within the relationship of those tribes. It's also spoken about as the largest gathering of native and non-native peoples ever, also since colonization, similarly to come together for a common purpose or to share and occupy space together. Obviously, that would bring with it kind of complications and things to work out over the last 500 years or something, but I think necessarily, as we've spoken about, this increase in kind of infrastructural and kind of environmental issues are going to bring these kind of peoples and spaces and communities together in kind of both common cause and also conflict. I think, you know, like a lot of people spoke about, the incredible amount of kind of settler racism within North Dakota was quite, you know, powerful. Even Bismarck is just about 45 minutes away. And people there from the tribe and reservation said this probably set, you know, racial relations within the area back, you know, 20, 30 years or something. This thing, even if, you know, the casino was relatively recent and the casino had become a kind of valve within which kind of non-native people could relate to the tribe and reservation. And there's concerts and things like that there that people would come to. But now, you know, at some of the actions that had taken place in Mandan and Bismarck and just the general, you know, suspicion and conflict over Morton County and the governor's relationship, it's going to be incredibly fraught, you know, in the next 5, 10, 20 years, how the tribe and reservation relates to the broader kind of area around it. And I think in particular, as we've spoken about with this new Trump administration and this kind of alt-right phenomenon, there's again a new construction of whiteness being created within the U.S. that I think is going to take also a lot of kind of unpacking or something. There's this new kind of idea of European American that's not even white. It's almost more kind of reactionary than white or something. But, you know, Standing Rock in that sense becomes incredibly potent and inspiring, even, you know, not to say that all of these conflicts haven't existed, because they do very much. Like I talked about some of these areas within it where there's non-native people, these kind of non-native ghettos, if you want to call it that or something. It's kind of bizarre. But I think, you know, these things are incredibly potent, you know, for the future to continue to see what that'll kind of lead towards. There's also a question, not just racially, but spatially, about kind of urban movements or political identities versus rural or kind of these other things. One of the other interesting parts of Standing Rock is that it's not a city. So just being in a city, it itself leads to certain kinds of political identification, kind of racial or ethnic identification, et cetera, versus if you're in a prairie or a field or a valley or a kind of river valley, you know what I mean? That itself has different forms of identification and different forms of political mobilization and solidarity and possibility or something. And I think more and more you'll see these kind of spatial configurations start to change as we think about politics, think about organization and infrastructure, think about power, basically. How does power function? And I think more and more with Standing Rock, you see power functions to some extent through infrastructure and through resources. And that's what you're seeing with these environmental movements or climate movements or something, to think more towards that and not some of these kind of spectacular circus things like that happen in cities, that happen in places like New York, which are incredibly absurd, you know? So I think we can rethink of Standing Rock in that sense too.
So the nation-to-nation organizing that was happening at Standing Rock, I think, was prefigured in a little ways a couple years back during the Keystone Pipeline with mutual defense compacts that were being created between different nations that were going to be impacted by that. And there was kind of a curious alliance at the time called the Cowboy and Indian Alliance that kind of emerged from that. And at this moccasins on the ground training that was happening at Pine Ridge about 4 years ago, and this rancher got up, and this white rancher got up and spoke to this room of Native people about, the government's coming to take my land. And then this, elder got up, his grandma gets up afterwards, and she's like, well, welcome to the club. And I think one thing that's happening is that because capital is kind of increasingly needing these sort of access easements, right, to move this product, the racial identification doesn't quite matter, right? The tar sands blockade down in Texas happened on a white man's land, right, who bought that land but was also kind of put in this challenging situation vis-a-vis the state and vis-a-vis capital. And I think this goes directly to your other question on how do we organize, right? Because ultimately there is not some union or nonprofit or state entity that can help this constellation of fights happening. It's really more of a nation-to-nation, community-to-community defense capacity that we're trying to build, both against pipelines, but also against renewed white supremacist violence, right? So perhaps in immigrant communities and urban areas, right, this mutual defense capacity to resist roundups, deportations, white supremacist violence, perhaps could take a note from this and the need to create these mutual defense compacts and have these horizontal relationships with a capacity to resist violence and a capacity to also inflict and come back and stop pipelines and exercise and use power. And I think that was the big question infrastructurally that I think should be coming out of this. And certainly kind of within the logistics and infrastructure world that allowed it, we had these big questions. Where do these resources go next? There's dozens of emergent struggles that need this sort of support, that need the sort of donations that have been coming in. And so that question of how do we relate horizontally to be able to create that sort of infrastructure to defend our world against this encroaching one, whether it's the alt-right or increasing pipelines or whatnot. But I think that those are crucial questions that we continue to hash out. And I think seeing the horizontal relationships and the complexity involved of trying to organize across difference, across racial, ethnic, geographic difference. And I think there's a real rich experience at Standing Rock, and I hope kind of we continue to reflect on that and try to distill some lessons out from that.
I'm not going to take too much time with this, but I just want to relate kind of a human story, which through all this just jogged in my memory here. One of the days right before I was leaving, I was standing out in front of Perry Knight's casino, and an elderly couple was walking in, late 70s, early 80s maybe. I'm just standing out there. I had my headband on, my black headband and coat I have there, maybe a heavier coat. Just standing out there with another friend of mine who had blonde hair, a gentleman. We're just talking, taking a break, whatever. And the gentleman of this elderly couple said to me, protester. And I turned around and I was just like, I'm a protector. Like, meanwhile, I shouldn't even said anything, but I was just like, I didn't even see myself as a protester. I was just standing there. But because I didn't belong. But meanwhile, his wife, they were walking in, and his wife went like that with the thumb. So, like, among themselves, they had different views. He was walking into the casino, which he is, he had said to me when I said a protector, he said, I am from here. So it's strange how, evidently he's from Mandan, he's from Bismarck, he's not from the reservation, but here he is, probably clearly has his own view on what's going on. He's not one of the people that are actively harassing maybe the Native Americans, but he is, in the sense that he has an opinion and he's bigoted and he's on their reservation, on their land, being served by them, going into their casino, enjoying whatever he can do for that day, but he sees me there and just because of the way I look and I don't belong. So I think, trying to answer what you said in a human way, I think we have to feel uncomfortable in our skin. We have to be in a situation, unless we all come out of our little bubble, someone had mentioned a bubble before, until we get to the feeling where we feel uncomfortable in our own skin for something that we're just standing there having a conversation. Will we feel what Indigenous people are going through? Will we feel Black Lives Matters are going through? Will we feel a little bit humble? The other thing I wanted to say was I really feel that this needs to be at a school level. I think, I know growing up and going through school, I didn't know a lot about Vietnam. When I went to college at Hofstra University and I was in the journalism program, I knew about wars and I learned a lot about Vietnam back then. I learned a lot about what we did in Vietnam. And I also learned about how our soldiers were met. They didn't teach us that in the school books. I think they need to really start becoming honest in our histories because, quite so, I have 4 degrees. I think I'm pretty educated, but I'm ashamed to say I didn't know half the stuff that was going on with our Native Americans before this. And I think any movement that happens, and I'm from the Bernie Sanders movement originally, and I think a lot of what got me active, I am not technical at all. I have become technical and still learning in the world of how this stuff works and Facebook and everything else. But I believe until a movement happens, you got to continue it. You don't let it die, and other movements grow out of that movement. So all I can say is, from what you learn from here, learn, spread it, share it around, and you know the effect of 2 times 2 times 2 times 2. We get the word out. We get people who are empathetic. We get people who are compassionate. I think that's the first thing. You're never going to take someone like Trump and change his point of view, no matter how educated you might want to make him be. You need to have people who are compassionate come together and then help the cause. And that's really all we need to do until we can get into the school systems and change the school systems to really get everybody's view. It's not just Native Americans. It's other countries. It's in your country as well. I mean, it's what's happening. We have pipelines formulating right now on Long Island. So, I mean, we don't know any of this. We're in our own little bubble. And that's all I wanted to say. Until we feel it, I feel it now. I feel uncomfortable. I felt uncomfortable going into town. People, I had to go into the other thing I wanted to say was, here I am with the Native Americans. Then they asked me to go into Fort Yates to go to get the mail because someone didn't want to get the mail. And even though it's on the reservation, I went in there and I felt uncomfortable because I was on the reservation. Because you do have other people on the reservation that aren't part of what's happening up at the bridge. And there's the school and everything. I felt like I should have been invited onto the reservation. They looked at me like maybe I was an infiltrator. I don't know. I was nervous. And I shouldn't have to be nervous, but then I was the minority, which I haven't had to feel that for many years of my life. So it's humbled me. So.
In terms of things that are happening that are not physically in Standing Rock, I don't know that much about it, but I know there's a move to defund or divest from banks that have invested in DAPL. Does anyone that's more educated on that than me want to talk to that?
There was a demonstration yesterday at the Comptroller's office here in New York City. There was a meeting of the pension fund trustees, and the purpose was to get them to defund from the pension funds. By the way, public pension funds are just huge. And so the goal was to try to get them to defund from the petroleum companies, the petrochemical companies. And there's a lot of pushback from the trustees. They don't want to hear it. They didn't want to let the demonstrators come upstairs, only in small numbers. Well, it was a modest-sized demonstration, but we clearly need a lot more people doing that. And I think it also would parallel the fight, and it's just really the same fight, to get put pressure on those 17 banks that are invested in DAPL. It's kind of like follow the money, and we've got to build resistance about where that money is. My brother here has been talking a lot about capital and the way it's flowing. We've got to we've got to block the flow of the capital, because that'll then in turn block the flow of the oil and the natural gas and all that stuff through these pipelines. One last little thing I would like to say, I've seen a lot of stop the pipelines. You know, we're living in a city that was destroyed by Sandy to a great degree, especially frontline communities down in the water and in this whole region, and it's not just us. There is so much work that could be done and to put people to work from very communities, building new pipelines for water and so on right here in the city. And you know, it's a shame. It's a tragedy, or it's worse. The labor movement so far hasn't seen a chance to say, you know what, we're on the wrong side of history on this one. And we could be rebuilding our cities, rejuvenating this country, putting a lot of people to work, et cetera, et cetera.
It lists the banks so that you know which banks, and there's also then resources about what alternatives might be in terms of friendlier banks or in terms of credit unions. You know, I think that unlike other movement moments that I've been involved in terms of when there's been a push to move money, it's very hard to get people to do that oftentimes. Right now, it feels like there's a great deal of momentum around doing that. The city of Seattle just pulled out their money from Wells Fargo. So I think that that's one route that people are looking towards right now. As to speak directly to your question around legislative strategy, I think that that's something that is emergent right now. I don't feel qualified to speak to that, and you know, I think that there are many levels of both camp leadership and then tribal leadership that are involved in those conversations. So, but in terms of like things that you can do right now, moving your money, and then also if you live here, the Spectra pipeline is here. There are also Native-led organizations based here in New York City, in the tri-state area they connect with.
They've been speaking about also now Sunoco and Route 66, trying to have sort of the same thing, like to fund the banks to try to get more actions now against Sunoco. And I don't think we have Route 66 in New York, but that they're the next two biggest ones of the ones that are supporting the pipeline with the energy transfer partners. So if you can get that word out, I don't know if you have an organizer to do that. We're trying to do it out in Long Island. It's a little more difficult. I usually come into the city for to fund DAPL ones. But it's a little, it's still a little out there. It's not, I haven't gotten them to get that mindset yet. But that's what they've been asking for also from the Native Americans out at Standing Rock, is to try to do that now. So to go after them peacefully.
I just have a quick question, because it's very powerful to come and hear what has been going on at Standing Rock. I work with the veterans group, Veterans for Peace, Vietnam Veterans Against the War. I work with NAP and IVAW. And there's a couple of things that I think are really important at this point in time. One is, how do we learn from what your all experience has been at Standing Rock? Are you all available to come and speak with other organizations and groups? What I think is really important is we've heard a lot of different issues raised tonight. Is there something that can be put together that would help, in fact, to educate the rest of us and the organizations we work with? And going forward, we know how difficult this struggle has been. I'll just quickly mention, I was involved many years ago in 1973 with the takeover of Wounded Knee. I've been very active in working on peace and social justice issues. It feels like forever. And my question to you all and to people here tonight is, how do you see us moving forward together? I mean, I hear that we need to get into smaller groups and talk about issues. How do we do that, and how do we educate the public? And I'm sorry, but you know, I don't go on social media a whole lot. So I get my news from contacts and people I know. So for some of us, Matt has referred to me as an elder, so I can say for some of us elders, how do you see us moving forward? We have lots of experience, but where do we go from here? We certainly have never faced what I think is coming in next year with this administration, a very powerful enemy. How do we go forward and learn from the histories of the past? You don't need to answer no. Just think about it.
That's the question.
That's right. Because the media is not getting out there. The media that we all know is not getting out there. So.
This is just like a small example, or maybe a big example. I'm not really sure. I think everyone, or maybe most people here, are super afraid of what's going to come for yourselves and for people in your communities, and just like the state of this country and perhaps the world. And so what I have been seeing that is super positive and something I hadn't seen before are just like people really getting prepped. Like there's a lot of like resource guidelines of like, if you're undocumented, what are, like, if you're at this level of documentation, then this is what you should do for in the coming month. And if you're on this level, then don't apply for citizenship right now, because, like there's a lot of like resource guidelines for like queer folks who are in like transition, like for trans folks, like at different phases, like what should we do? And so I think that like the resources and like how like deeply concerned people are, that I think is something that's somewhat new, because, a lot of people that I have talked to that are like somewhat apolitical, or just like, doing their own like daily lives. Like I talk to them, I'm like, how do you feel about what's like coming, with Trump? And like they just start breaking down. And so I think that like that emotional response is one very positive, because like I think that people have maybe not had such a emotional response to like a conservative force that's coming our way. And so that I think is really positive, and hopefully will bring folks together. And the resource guides, where like many communities are like telling or guiding folks on like what to do next to prepare for a white supremacist and his gang of people coming in. And if people are interested in accessing those resource guides, I have like a list of them. So you can just talk to me, or I can put it on the Facebook group or whatever. So yeah, that's like something small I can think of that's like kind of a beam of light.
I think one of the things that could be a kind of lesson from Standing Rock for us who live in cities or live wherever is the extent to which people there were already organized and were already prepared for something like that. And I think one of the things, we spoke to a quote unquote elder in the camp we're staying in, and talked to him a little bit about Standing Rock, and he said the most important thing that really enabled the movement or the occupation was just the kinships that existed between people, between families or extended networks or extended families. And basically just the basic question of survival or something is that you can't, like in the conditions that are there now, you couldn't really go there as an individual and survive even. You have to do that with other people. So even just to think about this basic question of survival or something, like if you need wood or water or food or a tent or tarps or supplies. It's not you as an individual who are answering those questions. You're answering those questions with other people, collectively or communally, and that becomes your kind of extended network or camp or commune or whatever you want to think about it. And I think that's one of the things we can do or think about now is what are the kind of forms of kinship or forms of organization that we have or can build and work towards that either could enable you to live in a brutal winter in Standing Rock in North Dakota, or that could enable you to live in New York City in the coming years or something. In some ways, they're the same question. You know, what are the kinships or collectivities or our kind of potentialities for encampments, literal and kind of metaphorical encampments or something that will enable us to kind of survive at all? And a big part of that in the city or in kind of metropolitan life is we're taught or think we have to think of that individually, like ourself, like how do I survive or something. But it's like, no, how do we survive together? How do we survive whatever that might come at us or something? And I think that's the kind of question that I'd be happy to talk about, you know, with any of these organizations or with elders or whoever, people who aren't on social media or something. It's that question, and again, it's kind of what we tried to get at in our video, what we tried to emphasize a little bit, and they talk about it in that, is these relationships and kinships are the basis for every little small camp in the movement, and it then becomes the basis of the whole movement, basically. Is there's a web of relations and kinships and a way of thinking that makes this possible. And I think that becomes a kind of global phenomenon. The potentiality of that has to become broader, you know, that there's different little webs of kinships or something that can become resilient or offensive or resistant or something to Trump or whatever it might be, a Hurricane Sandy. It's the same question. You don't answer that question of Hurricane Sandy as an individual. You have to answer that with a group of people or whatever, you know? So I think, you know, that would be one response that I think we could all think about, you know, to what extent do we see ourselves within that kind of web or that kind of potential or that kind of relationality with each other, with our friends or families or neighbors, and even different generationally or something. If we have kids or parents or grandparents, how do we relate on that level to each other that we can answer these questions of survival? Basically, it becomes about survival, together.
I think another aspect of that really goes back to the stories that we tell about what's happening. There's a saying attributed to Sitting Bull that it doesn't take many words to speak truth. And I think one thing that was so powerful about what was happening at Standing Rock is the phrase "Mini Wachoni," or "water is life." And every time, jobs in various jurisdictions would come back and forth, and whether people were terrorists or whatnot, people would just have a simple answer: "Mini Wachoni, water is life." And I think that is so powerful because it is a values-based approach to politics that says that there's basically a line and you can't cross that line. Like, we cannot sacrifice water for future generations if we're indeed going to carry on. And I think similarly, there have been some very powerful truths spoken by movements in the last couple of years around Black Lives Mattering, that no one is illegal, right? That, climate is worth defending. And I think it's very important, similarly to these webs of networks and kind of understanding these different stories about how we're going to survive this next bit, also having some real clarity about the values that we stand for and the values that we're not going to compromise on as well. And I think those simple stories carry a tremendous amount of power, and I think the resonance of Standing Rock shows that.
I want to make one point that it seems from what you guys talked about, probably the key here is that there was a physical presence. This wasn't a social media event. There was a camp. There were thousands of people. And it spread across the country. And the same was true of Occupy. If you go back and look at the history of the movements over the last decade, it's a physical presence that actually is really important. And, I think our generation can attest to that going back a long time. And so it seems to me that now it's not just a question of surviving the next 4 years or 8 years or whatever, but it's turning it around and becoming the aggressive force of change by having a physical presence. So I know that, over the next couple of weeks, there's going to be a lot of people organizing to go to Washington. They have events here in New York City and other cities around the country. And it seems to me that one of the things that came out of the films and what you guys were saying is that the courage of the people to go out there and be there in the face of all that repression and in the face of the weather and in the face of, being ignored by the larger population. And I think that that's what we're called on now. And, there's meetings happening all over. There's, a meeting at Cooper Union on Monday night to try and organize stopping before he starts. I think, that the physical presence is really a key to moving forward here. And, there's a lot goes into making that happen. But I'm totally impressed by what they managed to do by creating that space with people in it.
Oh, I was just thinking maybe we could talk amongst each other, if that's okay. Yeah, and this is a space that Deep Dish kind of has access to. And it was really useful during Occupy Wall Street. People would meet here. So if anybody has an interest in, having an event here, a planning meeting or something, just contact me, because we really want to encourage direct communication and organization. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here.